Hello there, welcome to my review of the Rockford Files Season 2, Episode 20, Where's Houston? Written by Don Carlos Dunaway and directed by Lawrence Stoney. The episode begins with two goons watching the unassuming home of an old man, who they proceed to follow all the way to Jim's trailer. He's Pete Prelly, an old friend of Rocky's who needs Jim's help. His granddaughter, the Houston of the title, has been kidnapped, and he's waiting to hear about the ransom demands.
Pete, I think the first thing you ought to do is call the police in on this.
No police, the man said that.
Jim gets on the case immediately, while the goons continue to follow Pete. At Houston's home, Jim discovers the door has been bust down, and there's scenes of a disturbance throughout the house. From this opening, it seems like a straightforward case, but as Jim leaves, he's cornered by the goons along with additional support, and warned off the Prelly case. And when he goes to tell Pete what happened, he finds him dead. What has gone from a straightforward kidnapping is now a murder, and the intrigue takes a step up again when Deal informs Jim and Rocky that Pete didn't have any money.
What they could have got out of him couldn't have paid for the gags and the ropes to tie his granddaughter up with.
Rocky explains that Pete was always either rich or broke, depending on how his latest deal had gone down. But it's clear from his current situation that he was at one of his low points, so Lieutenant Deal can't understand why anybody would want to hit him up for ransom. The intrigue continues to escalate as Jim takes the cops to Houston's house, where the door is fine and the place is tidy.
I don't understand it. Now, this place was a wreck.
The first act of this episode is pure escalation of mystery, where we get one piece of the puzzle only to find an entirely new puzzle has appeared. It all happens very quickly, and yet is a very logical progression, so at no point are we confused about the events. Fed up with Jim already, Deal arrests him and it's up to Beth to get him out. We don't see any of this, as in order to expedite the plot, certain scenes are dealt with via dialogue. This is something the show couldn't have done earlier in the series while it was establishing character, but now he's able to take some liberties with this format for storytelling purposes. And while it's always fun to see Beth annoy Deal, it's not necessary to the plot. Jim and Rocky go back to Houston's house, only to have her walk in on them. She's been out of the country in Mexico working on a deal to help restore her granddad's fortune, and is heartbroken to discover his murder. As they're taking her to the police station, her boyfriend,
Jerry Speck, Houston's boyfriend.
Friend.
turns up and offers to take her. Jim is convinced that there's more going on than he and Rocky are aware of, and is also convinced that Pete had a secret stash of money in his house, so go looking.
What'll they do to us if they find us with all these burglar tools?
They're not burglar tools.
Unable to find anything, they then discover that Pete's neighbourhood is being gentrified, and Pete's fortune wasn't in his house, it was his house, which Houston has now inherited. We are now in the unravelling phase of this particular mystery, as Jim now has a good idea of why everything has happened, but no clue as to who is involved. While we haven't seen much of him in a while, it's also nice to see that Rocky is integral to this story, and Noah Beery puts in a masterful performance. The father-son relationship is built upon, and it's easy to believe that these two characters are related based on how they interact with each other.
Rock, I got him. He had a fortune.
He did.
Yeah, he sure did.
As this case involves Rocky's friend, he's not going to try and dissuade Jim from going forward with the case as he usually does, but he's actually now an active participant, whether Jim likes it or not. And it's a lovely dimension to add to the character. Jim only allowing him to take part while there's no obvious danger. Also, Act 2 has much less need for exposition, as all of the setup was done in Act 1, so scenes are given a little more time to breathe, and we find out more about Houston's relationship with her granddad.
You're pretty good at snapping out orders. Almost as good as Granddad.
This is also an opportunity to showcase yet another clever way Jim has devised to get away from the goons following him, as he stops to let Houston out to buy cigarettes, only to use the moment to escape the goons.
How do we know she's not going out the back?
Because I saw her throw out an empty cigarette pack just before they stopped.
It's a great example of how the character is always thinking and assessing the situation. He knows he doesn't always get away in a chase, so rather than risk Houston's life, he makes sure she is safe first. This is a facet of the character you would struggle to show in a film, but on TV it's perfect, as repeat viewers get to see an original way of dealing with the tale, while new viewers get to enjoy a novel escape. Jim discovers that Houston's friend Jerry is actually involved in the real estate buyout. However, when he goes to confront him, finds that he too has been murdered. We then get a touching scene when Jim goes to tell Houston of Jerry's death, where he tries to convince her not to bottle up her emotions.
What do you want from me anyway?
Oh, a little emotion.
In an earlier scene, we are given the sense that Jim infantilizes Houston's stump somewhat, as Rocky describes how Pete raised her to be as tough as a man.
Houston had to pull her freight just like a man.
Didn't it ever occur to Pete that she was just a little girl?
But this is dispelled completely here, as he attempts to get her to open up more.
There's nothing wrong with letting some emotion show, you know.
He explains there's nothing manly about holding in your feelings or not allowing yourself to cry when you feel like crying.
Men don't cry.
Oh, sure they do. I've done it a couple of times myself.
This is an astounding trait for the character to have in the 1970s, and one that spits in the face of the idea that toxic masculinity is a modern invention. 50 years on from this episode, it's still not particularly acceptable for a man to cry, and yet here is a war vet and tough as teak private investigator, Jim Rockford, actively advocating for it as a healthy emotional response. If ever there was an example of how ahead of its time this show was, I think this is it. In order to catch the men behind all this, Jim sets up a meeting with one of their dummy corporations to sell Pete's house, and we finally meet the boss behind all this.
20,000 plus your health.
Who threatens Jim, but Jim's no fool and doesn't budge an inch, fully aware that Mr. Blackthorne has no intention of honouring his end of the bargain.
You're a big disappointment to me, Mr. Blackhorn. I really thought we could do business.
As the deal is about to be made, at gunpoint, and very much in Mr. Blackthorne's favour, the cops show up.
You didn't really expect me to give you a check for $100,000, did you?
No, Mr. Blackhorn, I didn't really expect you to.
This is a really tightly paced, hard-boiled mystery that wouldn't be out of place in a film noir. And Garner is brilliant, making Rockford's lighter touch really fit in with a slightly darker plot. We get enough exploration of Houston's character to tell us all we need to know about her, and the emotional scenes are perfectly pitched, so at no point does Jim come off as preachy. My only criticism of this episode is that the mastermind is revealed far too late for us to really enjoy his comeuppance. It's a problem the series has had before on a few occasions, and I always feel it could benefit from giving us just a little more time with the villain, rather than just focusing on the goons. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. Thankfully, I think it does work in this episode to add some dramatic tension to proceedings, so it's more of a criticism of this repeated trope than the episode itself. Which is why for me this is a 5 out of 5. Thank you. Goodbye.